Deep state, a state within a state. I'm guessing many of you have heard these ominous words tossed around over the past few years. Political analysts, conspiracy theorists, and world leaders alike have been sounding the alarm about the deep state. But here's the strange part. Very few can clearly explain what it actually is. Why has the idea of the deep state become even more popular than the concept of a world government? Everyone keeps circling around it, but rarely says anything concrete. And that's understandable. In today's political and media language, few terms are as mysterious, yet so widely recognized as the deep state. The notion of a state within a state actually dates back to the 19th century. But make no mistake, the deep state isn't just the visible government you see. You won't spot it with the naked eye. It hides behind the facade of public politics, operates from back rooms, and rules from the shadows, doing everything it can to remain unseen. Today I'll take you through how the deep state took root in some of the world's largest and most powerful nations. We'll uncover how it works, what it truly aims for, who it answers to, and the brutal fate that often awaits its enemies. This video blends history, political theory, and a touch of conspiracy thinking. We'll explore the deep state's influence in Middle Eastern countries, dive into American intelligence operations, dig into the real reasons behind JFK's assassination, and of course, we won't forget about Donald Trump. November 1996, a quiet Sunday evening. Millions of people across Turkey are watching TV, talking about how Fenerbahce or Galatasaray played, when suddenly all the main channels break their broadcasts. A news ticker flashes across the screen. Car accident near the town of Susurluk, between Istanbul and Izmir. 3 dead, 1 injured. At first it seemed like just another accident, nothing special. But soon it became clear this wasn't an ordinary crash. It was an event that would change Turkish history forever. What mattered was who was in that car. The deputy chief of Istanbul police, 2 unidentified individuals, and Sedat Bukak, a prominent member of parliament and commander of anti-Kurdish militia forces. Out of everyone in the car, only Bukak survived. Just to remind you, the Kurds are the largest stateless nation in the world, bigger even than the Romani. But unlike the Romani, the Kurds have a strong national identity. They are spread across Southwest Asia, and most of them live in Turkey. For over 100 years, they have been fighting for independence, and the Turkish government has been fighting just as hard to stop them. As investigators dug into the crash, the real shock came. Among the dead was Abdullah Çatlı, and that name made headlines across the country. Çatlı was the leader of the ultra-nationalist organization known outside Turkey as the Grey Wolves, or Bozkurt in Turkish. Authorities had been hunting him for nearly 20 years. His record included drug trafficking across Europe, political assassinations, ties to an attempt on the life of the Pope, and a legendary prison escape from Switzerland in 1990, a full 11 years before El Chapo pulled off something similar. To add to the scandal, Çatlı's lover, who also died in the crash, was carrying a forged green passport, an official document normally reserved for government officials. So in one crash car, you had a senior police official, a member of parliament fighting Kurdish separatists, a notorious criminal wanted by Interpol, and his girlfriend traveling under fake government papers. It was like a scene straight out of a mafia movie. Naturally, people started asking the obvious question: what were a deputy police chief and a top MP doing riding around with a terrorist? What did they want from him? Or what did he want from them? The next morning, Turkey's biggest newspaper ran a giant headline: "The state knows about the corruption." Public trust in the political system collapsed almost overnight. Here was a government claiming to fight far-right extremists, while its top officials were casually driving around with one of the most wanted men in Europe. The prime minister tried to distance himself immediately, saying, "The situation is more serious than we thought. It involves the military, police, politicians, and mafia figures." The scandals kept pouring out. Every evening, millions of Turkish citizens turned off their lights for 1 minute in protest. Street demonstrations erupted nationwide. Parliament launched a special investigation. And then, the whole thing disappeared into the bureaucracy. The scandal was buried. The surviving lawmaker simply returned to politics like nothing had happened. The media quickly painted him as a loyal patriot who had always taken the government's side in the Kurdish conflict. But the message was clear to everyone. The government was so desperate to crush the Kurdish movement that it had willingly partnered with killers, drug dealers, and terrorists. Just 2 months earlier, the Kurdistan Workers' Party had declared a ceasefire, and instead of pursuing peace, parts of the Turkish state had decided it was easier to wage war by working with people whose hands were soaked in blood. One car crash had exposed a hidden reality. The government itself was entangled with organized crime, not just locally, but internationally. And the aftershocks didn't stop there. The Turkish military, always a powerful force in the country, moved in. They issued a public ultimatum to the prime minister, forcing him to resign. This wasn't the typical military coup Turkey had seen before. It was called a post-modern velvet coup, the first time in Turkish history that words and public pressure, not guns, toppled a government. The ruling party was banned. Prime Minister Erbakan, considered the father of modern political Islam in Turkey, was barred from politics for 5 years, and stepping into the spotlight was his protege, the young mayor of Istanbul, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In 2001, Erdogan would found his own party. A year later, they would win the elections. But Erdogan never forgot the crash at Susurluk. Neither did Turkey. After that accident, a new term entered the national vocabulary. Derin Devlet, the deep state, a hidden, parallel structure of power that operated beyond the public's view. The very concept the whole world would be talking about 2 decades later. We didn't start our story with America, Russia, or the European Union by accident. We began with Turkey. It's no coincidence that this country became the birthplace of the idea of the deep state. But first, we need a quick historical detour. The Ottomans, originally a small principality, by the 15th century had become a major power across Europe, Asia, and Africa. They controlled the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa, and territories stretching from Hungary to Crimea and the Caucasus. Their political and military expansion made them many enemies. Just with Russia alone, they fought 12 wars. But starting around the 17th century, the empire began to wither, military defeats, economic crises, incompetent rulers. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had earned a humiliating nickname, the sick man of Europe. And that's despite the fact that at the time, it still included places like modern Syria, Iraq, and Kuwait. When an empire weakens, nationalism rises, and along with it, repression of minorities, often not from a position of strength, but from fear. It's a fairly common historical pattern. In 1908, a group of nationalist officers seized power. The Committee of Union and Progress, also known as the Young Turks. Among them was a young man who would later be known as Ataturk, the founding father of modern Turkey, though at the time he was far from holding real power. The Young Turks promised to turn the Ottoman Sultanate into a parliamentary democracy, but in practice they established a triumvirate, 3 pashas, 3 autocrats backed by a sprawling web of security services and criminal networks. Their power relied heavily on alliances with crime syndicates, especially in the restless eastern regions. The backroom intrigues they dragged the empire into led to catastrophe. World War I, the Armenian Genocide, the Pontic Greek Genocide, and finally the collapse of the Ottoman state. The Young Turks didn't rule long, but they left behind a legacy of political culture built on endless plotting and hidden power struggles. After them came Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Yes, he was an autocrat, and yes, he held vast power, but like Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew, whose story, by the way, we can tell if you're interested, just drop a comment. He mostly used that power for the country's benefit. With the support of the military and police, he launched a massive project to build a modern, secular, Western-style Turkey. His set of ideas became known as Kemalism, and if you imagine Turkish history as a swinging pendulum, Kemalism sits at the perfect center. To the left, a secular European-style state. To the right, political Islam, the centuries-old system the Ottomans had lived under. And for nearly 100 years, this pendulum has been rocked back and forth by the deep state. If the regime drifted too far right toward Islamic rule, the military would step in and set things straight. If it drifted too far left, Same story. Internal forces would restore the balance. That's the story of Turkey throughout the 20th century. After Ataturk's death in 1938, his close ally held the country under tight control. But after World War II, Turkey allowed multi-party politics. In the 1950s, the Democrats came to power, bringing partial liberalization. But it was shaky. In 1960, the military staged its first coup. The prime minister was executed and officers took power. After that, the army never really left politics. The 70s and 80s were a time of chaos. Turkey was coming apart at the seams. The economy collapsed. Students and leftist activists clashed with the military regime, and the regime answered with bullets. Meanwhile, the Kurdish question and rising Islamism added even more fuel to the fire. In 1980, the military seized power again, this time establishing a full-blown dictatorship. They only handed power back in 1983, but by then the state machine had fundamentally changed. In the shadows, a new force had grown: the deep state. In Turkey, the term referred to a strange alliance of intelligence services, criminals, and ultranationalists. Even back in the 70s, top Turkish leaders were openly saying that a hidden force existed, one that even the military couldn't control. One prime minister bluntly stated, "There are two states in Turkey, one inside the other." But of course, no one was willing to name names. Any serious investigation could easily lead back to themselves. After that notorious car crash in the 90s, the deep state stopped being just a colorful metaphor. It became clear that shadow forces were actively shaping Turkish politics. Protests against the deep state helped bring Erdogan's party to power. In 2002, Erdogan promised to dismantle the hidden powers that he said had been inherited from the Ottoman Empire. From that moment on, every political crisis was immediately linked to rumors of some new conspiracy, and this wasn't dismissed as paranoia. Debates about the deep state happened openly in parliament, on talk shows, and everywhere in between. Left-wing parties accused the deep state of organizing the 1977 May Day massacre, where dozens were killed. Right-wing parties claimed the deep state was funding labor unrest. But everyone agreed on one thing: the deep state was real, just cleverly hidden and completely above the law. By the mid-2000s, the rhetoric got even harsher. Erdogan declared open war against the deep state. In 2008, the famous Ergenekon trials began, targeting an ultra-nationalist group suspected of running a secret government for decades. High-ranking generals, politicians, businessmen, and journalists were arrested. Over 2 years, there were 13 waves of arrests, with more than 200 people imprisoned. It was seen as a triumph for the new government, the long-awaited end of the deep state era. But the story didn't go away. Authorities alleged that the arrested conspirators had been planning Operation Sledgehammer, a wave of bombings and riots to destabilize the country. They painted a dramatic picture. Turkish democracy had barely survived a hidden coup attempt. Still, it would be a mistake to think the deep state was just a political scare tactic. In Turkey, there were real reasons to believe in elite conspiracies. By the early 2010s, talk of the deep state quieted down. There were fewer stories in the media, fewer debates, but every time there was a new coup attempt, like in 2016, the old rumors returned. Even today, no one can say for sure, did Erdogan truly tame the deep state? Or is it just lying low, waiting for its next move? One thing is certain: while the deep state may have taken root in Turkey, the idea behind it, the very concept, was born somewhere else. Strictly speaking, you can find signs of a deep state in almost any country. All it takes is a structure engaged in secret, intelligence, counterintelligence, or similar operations to fall into the category of a special service or clandestine agency. But the key point is that it's not just any intelligence service. It's one that becomes so independent that it can act against the country's political leadership, either against its will or, in some cases, without even informing it. An autonomous state within a state, with enormous resources and minimal public oversight. Let's take a look around the world. For example, Pakistan, their intelligence services carried out operations in Afghanistan with CIA support. They've also been accused of sabotage in India, ties with Arab terrorists, and links to religious radicals in China and the Philippines. That's quite the resume for a deep state. Now let's turn to sunny Thailand, where for nearly 20 years there was the so-called network monarchy, informal elite tightly clustered around the king, holding enormous power even in the 20th century, despite the country already having a strong army and bureaucracy. Another variation of the deep state is the Turkish model we discussed earlier. Not just intelligence agencies, but an entire coalition of the military, spies, and organized crime, acting secretly and autonomously from democratically elected governments. Yet another classic deep state model is the military junta, originally formed through conspiracies among high-ranking officers who despise weak politicians. Think of the black colonels in Greece during the 1960s. They imposed harsh dictatorship, canceled elections, and eventually sent tanks against protesting students. Or the countless military regimes in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Ecuador. Even Costa Rica once saw a military coup. In Chile under Pinochet, the military didn't just control the government, they controlled huge swaths of the economy. They oversaw both the so-called Chilean economic miracle and the infamous death flights, when political prisoners were sedated, loaded onto helicopters, and thrown into the ocean. Truly, flights beyond your wildest dreams. Even in Europe, deep state debates pop up more often than you'd think. In Estonia, for example, they have the term Suveriek. In Switzerland, theories about hidden powers became mainstream in the 1980s, after it emerged that Swiss intelligence had been secretly spying on thousands of its own citizens. In Britain, the deep state is typically portrayed as liberal and pro-European. A former advisor to Boris Johnson once said that real power in the UK doesn't belong to ministers, but to the unelected high-ranking bureaucrats, and that it was them, not politicians, who tried to block Brexit.
That there was some plot by the deep state to kill Brexit, and that is precisely, that is what many people would conclude.
Well, in the homeland of the Freemasons, it's no surprise that such theories thrive. In the 20th century, state within a state could mean any structure that wielded suspiciously large amounts of power. It wasn't always pinned on the secret services. In the US, Germany, and Israel, people sometimes suspected labor unions. In Latin America, the United Fruit Company. In North Africa and the Middle East, everything changed after the Arab Spring, the wave of democratic uprisings or coups, depending on your perspective. That swept the region in 2011. But just as quickly as the wave surged, it crashed. And that's when the deep state idea began appearing in Arabic-speaking countries too. Take Egypt, for example. In 2011, Hosni Mubarak's regime was crumbling. Social issues, corruption, and bureaucratic decay had undermined his rule. Mubarak had been in power for nearly 30 years, but a few weeks of protests were enough to bring it all down. Watching the chaos unfold, most people didn't realize that behind the facade of Mubarak's regime stood a far more powerful force, the Egyptian military. They were the real deep state. Without them, the revolution would never have succeeded. Egypt's deep state rests on 5 pillars: the army, intelligence agencies, the police, the judiciary, and the media. Together, they ensure stability, so you don't have to be afraid to visit the pyramids. The army has controlled Egypt's deep state since 1952. Over the next 6 decades, they turned the economy into a massive state-owned machine. They controlled hotels, restaurants, factories, oil companies, even pasta and olive oil production. After Egypt's peace treaty with Israel in 1978, the military realized that trade was more profitable than war. They poured investments into construction, tourism, and agriculture. Meanwhile, the United States was sending Egypt $1.3 billion annually to reward them for keeping peace with Israel and opposing the Soviet Union. Money flowed in torrents, and the military's influence only deepened. Today, it's still unclear just how much of Egypt's economy is controlled by the military, but estimates range from a quarter to half. Mubarak himself came to power in 1981 and ruled for 30 years, largely because the deep state approved of him. But then he made a fatal mistake. He began grooming a successor who was independent of the army. That was something the deep state couldn't allow. So when protests erupted in 2011, the military simply stood aside and watched Mubarak lose control. The police, overwhelmed, couldn't suppress the crowds alone. Eventually, the army issued a statement, "We guarantee the fulfillment of the people's demands." It was a clear signal. Mubarak was finished. The deep state had quietly toppled their tired old leader, and that was just the beginning. A year later, a new president, an Islamist, was elected. But the deep state was never going to let him consolidate power. The army, police, judiciary, and security services sabotaged every move he made. Half the country ignored his orders. His supporters accused the deep state of sabotaging democracy. His opponents accused him of trying to build an Islamist deep state of his own. Either way, nothing worked. Reforms stalled. The economy collapsed. Crises piled up. Energy shortages, religious conflicts, even mass brawls between soccer fans. It was a perfect storm, and the new president didn't survive it for long. In 2013, protests erupted against him. The police stood by and let protesters burn down the ruling party's headquarters. And here's the kicker. As soon as the president resigned, fuel shortages magically ended, lights came back on, and police officers reappeared on the streets. Today, Egypt is ruled by a general, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. His portraits are everywhere in Cairo. He's called the Arab Eagle and a man worthy of trust. A year before Mubarak's fall, while still an active military officer, Sisi wrote a classified report to the Minister of Defense stating, "If a rebellion breaks out, the army must side with the people." This is Dwight Eisenhower, a general, a World War II hero, and the 34th President of the United States. You're about to hear his farewell address. Soon he would leave the White House forever.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications.
Eisenhower warned that the military-industrial complex would eventually threaten American democracy itself, and these weren't empty words. The president knew exactly what he was talking about. World War II had permanently changed the United States. Before it, Americans never maintained a large standing army, nor did they invest heavily in the defense sector. But after witnessing Hitler's rise in Europe, that approach no longer worked. In the fall of 1939, the Council on Foreign Relations launched a secret study called War Peace Studies, funded generously by the Rockefeller Foundation. The main question was obvious. What threat would a new war in Europe pose to America? Researchers concluded that the country would need to completely rethink its security concept. The logic was simple. Security could no longer be seen narrowly, just defending borders and maintaining an army. In the modern world, everything was interconnected. Even America could no longer simply hide behind oceans if things went wrong. Scientific and technological progress made military threats transatlantic, global. Considering that within a few years the Nazis came close to inventing the atomic bomb, the idea turned out to be prophetic. After World War II ended, the US developed the concept of a national security system. Since threats were now global, America had to be ready at all times. The system was built around the army, intelligence agencies, diplomacy, and the defense industry. Let's lock this point in. National security during the Cold War became the backbone of US policy, and from it, America's deep state would grow. A turning point came with the National Security Act of 1947. It laid the foundation for creating the CIA, the NSA, and the National Security Council. These new agencies quickly adapted to the new agenda and started fighting communism, both real and imagined. Tellingly, the old War Department, which had existed since George Washington's time, was renamed the Department of Defense. In 1947, the US was at its peak. For decades, it had already been the richest country in the world. Now Europe and half of Asia lay in ruins. Add nuclear weapons to the mix. The American elite realized they could reshape the global order to their liking. But first, they had work to do at home. They had to kill isolationism, the idea that the US should stay out of world affairs. They didn't even give it a chance. The decision to abandon disarmament was made behind closed doors. No public debates, no voting. Then American propaganda kicked in. To make it sound more humane, they emphasized protecting the people of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Saving Europe from communism? Could there be a nobler mission? Thus was born the myth of the US as a benevolent hegemon, the alternative to the Soviet Union and global communism. Samuel Huntington, advisor to American presidents and author of the famous Clash of Civilizations, summed it up perfectly. The architects of power in the United States must create an invisible force. Power remains strong while it remains hidden. Exposed to sunlight, it begins to evaporate. But now let's meet the man who pulled back the curtain on the American deep state, Frank Church. I'm guessing most of you have never heard his name before, and yet he was a monumental figure. Church became a U.S. senator in the 1950s. Early on, he was what we would now call a Cold War hawk. He served in Army intelligence in China during World War II. At first, he was a conformist. He stayed out of trouble and didn't question the system. But by the 1960s, his views began to shift. America was sinking deeper into the Vietnam quagmire. In 1962, Church visited the front lines. He became the first senator to openly say, "The official version of events doesn't add up." From a Cold War warrior, he evolved into the loudest critic of the system, what they used to call the American militarists back in Moscow. By the late 60s, he stood shoulder to shoulder with the hippies in torn jeans, speaking out against the Vietnam War. For him, it wasn't just a shameful war on the other side of the world, it was a threat to America itself. Church realized that under the banner of national security, U.S. intelligence agencies were expanding their control over both government and society. Back then, that sounded like paranoia. Soon, the Vietnam War ended. When people talk about that now, they usually recall the summer of love in anti-war marches. But what really ended the war wasn't John Lennon's songs. It was Congress slashing military funding. Frank Church helped push through that decision. Yet his greatest battle with the deep state was still ahead. On the evening of June 17, 1972, an obscure horror movie was airing on American television. Attack of the Puppet People, a low-budget B-movie. Watching it from a Washington apartment across from the Watergate office complex was Alfred Baldwin. He was supposed to be on lookout duty while 5 men planted bugs in the Democratic National Committee headquarters. But Baldwin got so caught up in the movie that he didn't notice the cops arriving. Around 3 a.m., the burglars were caught red-handed, with bugs, cameras, and radios. One of them turned out to be CIA agent James McCord. President Nixon claimed the White House had nothing to do with the break-in. At first, Americans believed him, but soon, thanks to the Washington Post, the truth came out. The president had lied. Nixon's re-election team had been wiretapping opponents. With each new revelation, Nixon's approval ratings plummeted. When the Senate hearings were broadcast live, Nixon's political career was finished.
But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. I've earned everything I've got.
The first to crack was former CIA agent James McCord. He named names, cited sums, and exposed the whole network, including ex-FBI and CIA people working for Nixon's re-election team. He revealed that Nixon personally hired operatives known as the White House plumbers, tasked with covering up scandals and digging dirt on rivals. These same plumbers had likely broken into Watergate. Only one person ended up serving time. Nixon resigned a year later, still the only U.S. president ever to do so. Yet the biggest question remained unanswered. Did Nixon know about the break-in ahead of time? Or was it rogue staffers going too far? And why were the FBI and CIA repeatedly implicated? The scandals didn't stop there. In December 1974, New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh, famous for exposing the My Lai massacre and covering Watergate, dropped a bombshell. The CIA, he revealed, had been spying on Americans for years, especially anti-war activists. Frank Church immediately backed Hersh. He was already investigating U.S. corporate influence abroad. To no one's great surprise, it turned out the CIA's fingerprints were all over events in Chile, the most anti-communist country after the U.S. and South Korea. Hersh and Church concluded the same thing. America's intelligence agencies wielded far more power, both foreign and domestic, than anyone had realized. Washington shook. Riding the scandal, Democrats crushed Republicans in the 1974 elections. Some politicians, like Nixon, were carried out feet first, politically speaking. Once Democrats controlled Congress, they got serious about investigating abuses of power. Society had a right to know who was pulling the strings. Sensing that he finally had the freedom to act, Frank Church got to work.
Well, it's a bill that would set up a permanent oversight committee with sufficient authority both to keep the secrets that are legitimate and expose wrongdoing when it occurs. We want to be sure that this country stays free.
But newly sworn-in President Gerald Ford threw up roadblocks. In the U.S., the Senate and the President don't have to see eye to eye, especially when it comes to the deep state. Pressure on Church's committee grew, and this isn't a figure of speech. 3 key witnesses mysteriously died, one just before giving testimony. No hard evidence proved the CIA or anyone close to Ford was involved, but the timing raised eyebrows. In the spring of 1976, the Church Committee released its final report. 6 thick volumes. It was an information bomb. One of the key findings: the 1947 National Security Act had never authorized the CIA to carry out covert operations. Officially, the CIA was supposed to gather intelligence, advise policymakers, and coordinate national security efforts. But very quickly, the agency became a factory of covert action. Sometimes the White House approved, sometimes the CIA acted on its own. By the 1970s, the CIA had effectively become a shadow government. Its architects were the Dulles brothers. One was Secretary of State, the other head of the CIA. Allen Dulles built an elite agency loyal only to a small circle of power. His brother John controlled foreign policy. Both were deeply tied to American business elites. Under their watch, the CIA secured U.S. access to Iranian oil, Guatemalan bananas, and African minerals. Even before the final report, the Church Committee revealed that the CIA had plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, mostly rogue generals and autocrats unfriendly to Washington. The most famous target, of course, was Fidel Castro. The Kennedy administration tried to recruit mob bosses to poison him. All attempts failed. President Ford tried to block the report, but under pressure, he signed an executive order banning U.S. intelligence from assassinating foreign leaders, at least officially. What else did the investigation uncover? For example, Operation Shamrock. Major U.S. telecom companies had been handing the NSA data on millions of phone calls and messages. By the 1970s, just about every major political figure was on that list, including Frank Church himself. In the 50s, the CIA and FBI intercepted and photographed 200,000 paper letters without warrants, just for prevention. The CIA meddled in coups from Guatemala to Iran, Chile to Congo, spied on anti-war activists and Black Power leaders inside the U.S., collaborated with corporations, crushed unions, and suppressed social movements, often without even informing the sitting president. Ironically, the CIA's internal spy database was named Hydra. Great sense of humor. The Church Committee also looked into JFK's assassination. After interviewing 50 witnesses and reviewing 3,000 documents, they concluded that CIA plots, especially those targeting Cuba, might have indirectly led to Kennedy's death. They criticized U.S. intelligence agencies for negligence. The Senate report was the biggest intelligence leak in American history. Journalists called Church the American Cicero because, like the Roman orator, he urged his country to abandon empire building and return to Republican ideals. In Latin America, especially Chile, anti-American sentiment surged. In Europe, debates about limiting intelligence agencies' powers erupted. In the USSR, they first said, "Told you so," then gleefully pushed stories about CIA-backed coups in Chile and Iran and attempts on Castro's life. Meanwhile, back in the US, things slowly went back to business as usual. No sweeping laws reigned in the intelligence agencies. Technically, a court order was now required for wiretaps. Technically, assassinating foreign leaders was banned. But proxy actors who could do the dirty work? No law against that. Under Reagan, covert ops were revived. The deep state didn't reinvent the wheel. It supported dictators in Latin America, funded regime changes, and kept the machinery running. The most famous case, the Iran-Contra affair. Congress had banned arms sales to Iran and aid to Nicaraguan rebels. But surprise, surprise, the intelligence community did both. When the scandal broke, it caused a huge uproar. But unlike Watergate, no major heads rolled. Reagan's approval ratings barely budged.
America's long-standing goals in the region to bring an honorable end to the bloody Iran-Iraq war, to halt the export of subversion and terrorism in the region.
In fact, almost every major political scandal in post-war America somehow touched the deep state. The most surprising thing is not that it survived, but that it got smarter, more resilient, and if anyone dared to talk about it too loudly, they were dismissed as paranoid conspiracy theorists. But what happens when a full-blown conspiracy theorist becomes president and moves into the White House? Donald Trump hates the deep state.
Here's my plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption once and for all.
Dozens, hundreds, if not thousands of tweets, remarks, statements, interviews. And Trump isn't unique in this. Hatred of bureaucracy is practically mandatory for any American politician who wants to win over voters. Every recent U.S. president has entered the White House with a wagon load of promises to drain the swamp and grab the sluggish government machine by the throat. But reality always hits. In 4 years, or even 8 if you're lucky enough to get reelected, you might fulfill, if you're lucky, 15 to 20% of what you promised. On one hand, that's a good thing. Strong institutions block not only bad ideas, but reckless ones too. Even if a leader decides to do something absurd, the system holds. But on the other hand, even good projects end up dragging out for years, and elections are always just around the corner. You spend years trying to pass a reform, and the real impact won't be seen for another decade. No political points for you today. Where's the fairness in that? And of course, there's always the sinister deep state to blame. Ronald Reagan believed secret liberals at the State Department were sabotaging his crusade against communism. George Bush Sr. didn't trust independent prosecutors. Bill Clinton thought the FBI was out of control. The Bush Jr. administration turned on the intelligence community after 9/11. Barack Obama blamed the deep state for preventing the closure of Guantanamo and supposedly forcing him to send even more troops to Afghanistan. All of this has been said publicly by U.S. presidents whose names you definitely know. But no one ever raged against bureaucrats and intelligence agencies as fiercely as Donald Trump. The term deep state exploded into the headlines right after his inauguration in 2017. Trump and his allies labeled all their enemies inside the political elite, the so-called Washington swamp, as part of the deep state. That's another key Trumpist term, by the way. The Washington swamp. Official party line? Federal bureaucrats, especially from the security agencies, are sabotaging the president's orders. Trump and his advisor, Steve Bannon, insisted that Obama himself had organized the deep state attack against the new administration. It all started when Trump claimed that Obama had wiretapped his phone during the 2016 campaign. It's been over a decade, and Trump has never produced any real proof. But why did this obscure term, something only experts on Turkey or Egypt used to know, suddenly go viral in American politics? Credit, or blame, goes to 2 books. The first was called The War Conspiracy, where a Berkeley literature professor, Peter Scott, tried to expose the hidden mechanisms that supposedly lead to wars. His attempt didn't gain much traction. It was considered fringe, somewhere between pseudoscience and conspiracy theory. Then 20 years later, in 1993, Scott released his magnum opus, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. He argued that Kennedy's assassination wasn't the work of some lone conspiracy. It was a systemic correction of U.S. policy, benefiting intelligence agencies, organized crime, and big business alike. In short, Kennedy was killed because he planned to cut military spending, and that would have hit the military-industrial complex where it hurt. Scott was clever. He never made direct accusations. He didn't say outright that the intelligence agencies killed JFK, because of course he had no proof. Instead, he hinted, he nudged, he suggested, come on, can one lone man really just get up and kill the President of the United States? And yet, wasn't it incredibly convenient for the military-industrial complex? It's the same kind of thinking you'd hear if someone claimed the sugar industry secretly partnered with dentists and endocrinologists, just so we'd gorge on candy, wreck our teeth, get diabetes, and pour all our money into treatments. Sure, dentists do benefit when we eat too much sugar. But does that mean the World Dental Federation secretly teamed up with Coca-Cola and Mars to destroy our teeth, just so they could fix them for $1 gazillion? Well, if you've got a vivid imagination, absolutely. Thanks to Professor Scott, the term deep state entered American political discourse straight out of Turkish newspapers. Scott was a pessimist. He argued that all major political decisions are made by hidden actors whose names we don't know, operating outside public control. That's what he called deep politics, and way more people were involved than anyone wanted to admit. According to Scott, the deep state controls mainstream media, interferes in citizens' private lives, and corrects the country's course whenever the White House or Congress steers the wrong way. It wasn't Donald Trump, but Peter Scott who first laid out the deep state concept for the American public. And once that concept was out, it took on a life of its own. When Scott's work first came out, historians and social scientists rolled their eyes. They saw it for what it was: light political fiction for a niche audience, not serious research. But like it often happens, the academic snobs underestimated how influential a conspiracy theory could become in right-wing circles.
All right, we start tonight with breaking news. There is a second memo exposing deep state corruption.
After Donald Trump's first victory, the term deep state stormed into the mainstream. Several major Trump supporters published books about alleged plots to overthrow the president and the betrayal of the Washington swamp. Finding credible sources in those books is next to impossible, but attempted assassinations and multiple legal attacks on Trump only strengthened the belief. The deep state stopped being a fringe idea. It became part of everyday political language. Suddenly, even the people who used to scoff at such talk found themselves having to debate it seriously. What is the deep state really in the United States? Well, that depends on who you ask. There's no single unified deep state. Each side projects its own fears onto the idea. Left-leaning critics see the deep state as the military-industrial complex and big business corrupting politicians through lobbyists. Pretty much what Eisenhower warned about and what Bernie Sanders still talks about today. Right-leaning critics see the deep state as intelligence agencies, globalists, and population control fanatics. Trump, of course, has his own version. For him, the deep state is the FBI, NSA, and CIA, all tools of the Democratic Party, designed to repress him personally. The military is conveniently left out. Criticizing the army remains taboo. After Vietnam, the military somehow restored its public image. Trump and his supporters turned the deep state into America's existential enemy. One of Trump's biggest promises for his second term is to take apart the deep state brick by brick.
Either the deep state destroys America or we destroy the deep state. That's the way it's got to be.
And unlike his promise to build a giant wall with Mexico, he's already taken action. He launched DOGE, led by Elon Musk, aiming to slash bureaucrats from nonprofit and government institutions. Right now, half of America's top leadership could be considered deep state believers, at least in the Trumpian sense. Trump and the deep state are locked in a bitter, endless marriage, like two squabbling spouses. Their daily battles rage across social media and mainstream news. How will this end? Will the deep state still matter 10 years from now? We don't know. But one thing's obvious, to paraphrase Voltaire: if the deep state didn't exist, someone would have had to invent it. It's been almost an hour and I still haven't answered the most obvious question. Does the deep state exist or not? Okay, let's be honest. The deep state exists, but there won't be any loud, sensational revelations. First, the deep state, like any conspiracy theory, is something you can't definitively prove, but you also can't definitively disprove. It's like trying to explain why there was no nuclear war in the 19th century, as some conspiracy theorists do. Or like arguing about the flat Earth. We know it's not flat, but for a true believer, no scientific experiment or even space flight will ever be enough to change their mind. They'll always invent a new reason why physics doesn't work and the Earth rests on elephants standing on a giant turtle. So convincing someone that there's no dark monster sitting in a dark corner of a dark room, meaning the deep state, is simply an impossible task. In fact, any newly declassified information about the Kennedy assassination doesn't weaken the belief in a grand conspiracy. It only strengthens it among those who already believe. New indirect signs will be found to support the theory despite the lack of direct evidence, and the absence of proof will itself be declared part of the cover-up. That's why, for true believers in any ideology, stating their opinion, even in the form of an angry comment, is literally a kind of psychological relief. When we ask if the deep state is real, we're already asking the wrong question. Let's imagine a family: mom, dad, and 2 teenage kids. The big debate: where should they go for vacation? The parents want the countryside. The kids want the Caribbean. Technically, the parents hold all the power. They're older, they control the money, they make the final call. But realistically, without the kids, no one's going anywhere. The teenagers could throw a tantrum, pretend to run away, or even film dramatic video appeals about the oppression they suffer at home. Or they could promise to study harder, just to avoid going to the countryside. So where's the real power in that family? Is it only with the parents? Only with the kids? Or somewhere in between? There's no right answer. But there are 2 different schools of thought. Many people don't realize this, but deep state believers are simply looking at the system of power through a different lens. Classical political science usually leans toward pluralism, the idea that competition and conflict between political and business elites are normal and don't threaten democracy. Let them compete. The people still decide everything through elections. This view directly clashes with elite theory, formulated by American sociologist Charles Mills. Back during Eisenhower's era, Mills warned that open debate was shrinking. He saw the state becoming less transparent, developing a double bottom hidden from ordinary voters. In other words, the deep state debate is, like many ideological debates, a clash of values and faith. A deeply religious person will never see the world through an atheist's eyes, no matter how much you quote Dawkins or Ginsburg. Same thing here. Plus, the deep state theory, as we saw with Turkey, the Middle East, and the US, is grounded in real-world precedents. Powerful political and security elites do exist, and they don't always act openly. But does that mean they're constantly plotting against presidents or orchestrating grand conspiracies? That's another question entirely. And what exactly counts as a deep state? Every country has its own, and globalization, where anyone can access foreign news even without knowing English or Turkish, only fuels the spread of the deep state narrative. In Turkey, it was the defenders of Ataturk's ideals and nationalists. In the US, it's much broader. It could mean just the security services, or it could mean the entire Washington bureaucracy. That's the view of Mike Lofgren, a key proponent of the deep state theory. In recent years, especially after Trump popularized it, the term has mutated. Now, deep state can mean any influential, quasi-governmental group someone wants to blame for something. The deep state is like venom. It latches onto other conspiracy theories and amplifies them, but it can't really exist on its own. Otherwise, it's just not interesting. Pick your favorite description: double government, parallel state, shadow state, deep governance. Translate it into any language. Adapt it to your local political reality, and it will find an audience. People love simple answers to complicated questions. That's why clashing, often totally uncoordinated political elites get blended into one giant deep state. It's an effective way to tell a compelling story or sell something. But if we want to get smarter, we have to resist the urge to oversimplify and accept that reality is messy and complex. Army-backed deep states in the Middle East are often messy patchworks of clans, officers' clubs, and private interests. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they rip each other apart. As for the complexity of America's new power system, sure, you could dumb it down into some kind of instant mix for the mass audience, but for me, well, instant coffee compared to real ground coffee, I'd rather flush it down the toilet. It's not coffee, it's a fraud. And today, the real question isn't whether the deep state exists or whether conspiracies are real. It's why so many people believe in them, or want to believe in them. Philosopher Frederick Jameson once said, "Conspiracy theories are a cognitive mapping for unhappy people in the postmodern era." In other words, they're an attempt to make sense of a world that feels increasingly senseless, and that's a prophetic idea. Jameson said it back in 1988. Despite having access to nearly all the world's knowledge, more and more people are turning to conspiracy theories. Sociology confirms this. People with mounting frustration and grievances lose trust in those who hold power. Deep state theories provide a simple answer to the burning question, who's to blame? In many ways, it's a desperate attempt to understand why life is so unfair, and just mocking believers means missing the real signal society is sending. In the case of the deep state, the problem is fundamentally about trust. The deep state is both a political reality and a myth, something people badly want to believe in. It's also a powerful political weapon, a populist ice axe used to smash into power structures. But at the same time, the deep state reveals something hopeful. People still want to believe in good governance. Notice, they don't blame the government as a whole. They blame the bad guys who hijacked it. It's human nature to believe that light could prevail if only the darkness didn't get in the way. And for that, we really can't blame anyone. If you're still here, you're the best kind of audience. New video coming soon. Stay sharp.